First story, the sound of the door. I remember that weekend vividly. My parents were out of town, some kind of anniversary trip, and I had the house to myself. At first, the idea of staying home alone seemed perfect. A break from the constant noise of college life, a chance to catch up on some assignments, and maybe even binge watch a few shows in peace. But by the time Friday evening rolled around, I found myself feeling uneasy. It's hard to explain, but you know that sensation, right? That creeping feeling that something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. The house was too quiet, too still, but I brushed it off. I figured I was just being paranoid. I had grown up here. Nothing bad had ever happened in this house. Why would it start now? By around 10 p.m., I settled onto the couch, ready to dive into a new series. That's when I heard it for the first time. A slow, deliberate creaking, like a door being pushed open just slightly. The sound was faint, but distinct, coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it might just be the wind. The old house was known to creak occasionally, especially when there was a breeze. But when I paused the show, I realized something odd. There was no wind tonight. Everything outside was calm. Maybe it was my imagination? Still, I decided to check it out just to be sure. I grabbed my phone, more for the flashlight than anything else, and made my way downstairs. The living room and kitchen were exactly as I'd left them, and every door in the house was closed. I even checked the front and back doors to be safe. Locked, just as I had left them. Satisfied, I returned upstairs, convincing myself it was just the house settling or maybe an old hinge creaking under its own weight. But then, just as I settled back into the couch, the sound came again. This time louder. The same slow, eerie creak of a door opening. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no denying it now. Something wasn't right. I rushed back downstairs, flipping on every light as I went. Nothing. Every door was still closed. I checked them all again. Locked, bolted, secure. For a moment, I thought maybe I was losing it. Maybe I was overtired, stressed out. I tried to push the thought away and double-checked everything before heading back to the living room. I even made sure all the windows were locked. By the time I got back upstairs, it was nearing midnight. I decided to call it a night. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, it happened again. That damn creaking. But this time, it wasn't just one door. It sounded like multiple doors were slowly opening, one after the other, echoing through the house. My heart started racing. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone again, and stepped into the hallway. Silence. No creaks. No movement. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The air felt heavier, like the house was closing in on me. Suddenly, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the stairs. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was unmistakable, but when I peered over the banister, the staircase was empty. I could swear the air was colder around me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I darted back into my room, locking the door behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This house, the one I grew up in, suddenly felt unfamiliar, unwelcoming. I told myself I was overreacting, that I just needed to sleep. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The creaking door returned. This time it was louder, closer, like it was just outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door, pressing my ear against the wood. For a few moments, there was nothing. Silence. But then, a long, drawn-out creak, as if someone or something was slowly pushing the door open from the other side. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't hear anything moving, but I could feel it. Panicking, I decided to leave the house. I wasn't going to stick around and find out what was making those noises. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and ran down the stairs. The front door was right in front of me. I could almost feel the fresh air of the night outside. I rushed toward it, my hand reaching for the lock. And that's when I saw it. The front door, The one I had been hearing creak open and close all night was locked from the inside. Not just locked, bolted shut. My hand trembled as I touched the lock, cold and unmoved, exactly as I'd left it hours ago. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The door I had been hearing wasn't opening on its own. It never had. Something had been inside the house with me, watching me, moving closer every time I heard that sound. I slowly backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway, my ears straining for any sign of movement. And then, just behind me, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, so close it sent shivers through my body. Leave. I didn't wait for a second warning. I ran, bolting out of the house, not caring about the doors, the locks, or anything else. I didn't stop running until I was far enough away to see the house from a distance. Standing there, panting, I looked back at the place I had always called home. The lights flickered in the windows, and for just a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind the curtains. I haven't gone back since, and I never will, because whatever was in that house, it wasn't alone. It wasn't just the creaking door. It was waiting for me, and I was almost too late to realize it. Second story, the locked room. When I inherited the house, it felt like something out of an old novel. A distant relative I'd never met left me this place in rural Virginia, and while it wasn't exactly the kind of inheritance you dream about, I couldn't pass up a free home. It was a sprawling, creaky old thing, built in the late 1800s, perched on the edge of a small, sleepy town. Charmingly eerie, with overgrown trees lining the property and a front porch that sagged under its own weight. At first glance, the house seemed perfect for someone like me. Quiet, isolated, and full of character. The kind of place where I could finally get some peace, away from the chaos of the city. It only had one odd feature: a locked room on the second floor. It was strange, sure, but the house had its quirks. The door was heavy oak with an ancient, brass lock, but there was no key to be found. Not among the things left behind, not under the dusty rugs, not hidden in a drawer. I asked the lawyer about it, but he shrugged it off, telling me the previous owner had never mentioned anything about a locked room. I decided not to worry about it. Maybe it was just a storage closet or some forgotten space, not worth the hassle. I moved in, unpacked, and set about making the house my own. For the first few nights, I didn't pay much attention to the room. But then the noises started. At first, it was just a faint creaking, like the floorboards settling under weight. You could chalk that up to an old house reacting to temperature changes, right? But then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something else. Movement. Not the random groans of the house, but deliberate shuffling steps coming from behind the locked door. I sat up, listening hard. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, dragging footsteps like someone or something was pacing back and forth inside. I forced myself to rationalize it. Old houses make weird noises, I told myself. Maybe it was just a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside through a vent. I even tried to laugh it off, convincing myself I was letting my imagination run wild. But it didn't stop. Every night, the sounds grew louder. First, the shuffling footsteps, then faint thudding, as if something was lightly knocking from inside the room. The strangest part? It always started around midnight, like clockwork. By the third night, the knocking wasn't so soft anymore. It was rhythmic, steady, like someone was pounding their fist against the door in a slow, methodical pattern. My heart would race as I lay there, trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself I wasn't slowly losing my mind. But it became impossible to sleep. The worst were the susurros. I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, if they were saying anything at all. It was just a low murmur, coming through the walls, like someone was standing on the other side of the door, whispering to themselves. Chilled me to the bone. After nearly a week of sleepless nights, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to open that room. Whatever was inside, whatever was making those noises, I needed to face it head on. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I called a locksmith. The guy showed up the next morning, his truck kicking up dust as it rumbled down the gravel road. He was friendly enough, though I could tell he was a bit skeptical when I explained the situation. Who wouldn't be? A locked room, strange noises. Sounds like the plot of a bad horror movie. But when he saw the lock, his demeanor shifted. He frowned, running his hand over the brass mechanism. "This is old," he muttered. "Real old. Don't see locks like this much anymore." It took him nearly an hour to get it open, the ancient metal resisting his tools at every turn. Finally, with a loud click, the door creaked open. I felt my stomach twist into knots as we stepped inside. The room was empty, completely barren. No furniture, no boxes, no sign of life. Just 4 bare walls, a wooden floor covered in dust, and a single small window. The air was frigid, colder than the rest of the house, despite it being the middle of summer. And it smelled stale, like the air had been trapped for years. The locksmith looked at me, clearly uncomfortable. He muttered something about the house settling and hurried out. I stood there for a moment, staring into the empty space, trying to wrap my mind around it. How could an empty room make so much noise? But after that, the noises stopped. No more footsteps, no more knocking. The house was silent again, and for the first time in days, I managed to get a full night's sleep. I thought it was over. Whatever had been causing the sounds had stopped now that the room was open. But I was wrong. The first time it happened, it was just after 3 a.m. I woke up with a jolt, feeling something shift in the room. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it. The creak of the door opening, the door to that locked room. It swung open on its own. I rushed to the hallway, but by the time I got there, the door was already ajar. I checked inside, still empty. The cold air hit me again, and I quickly shut the door, telling myself it was just a draft, a quirk of the old house. But the next night, it happened again. 3 a.m., like clockwork, the door creaked open. This time, I could feel it, a presence in the room. I couldn't see anything, but the air felt thick, oppressive. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. By the third night, I started sleeping with the door to my bedroom locked. But that didn't help. I woke up, paralyzed by a sensation that someone, or something, was lying beside me in bed. I could feel the weight on the mattress, the dip right next to where I was sleeping. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode. I didn't move, couldn't. The air was icy, and I swear I could hear breathing, slow, shallow breaths right next to me. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, praying it would go away. When I finally dared to open them, there was nothing there. But the door to the room was wide open, as if beckoning me. Now, every night at 3 a.m., that door swings open on its own. And every time, I wake up with that same sensation. Someone is lying beside me, watching, waiting. I don't know what was in that room before, but I fear it's found its way out now. And no matter what I do, I can't seem to get rid of it. Third story, the television. There's a kind of comfort in the glow of a TV on a quiet night. For me, it was a ritual. After a long day at work, I'd curl up on the couch, the hum of the TV filling the otherwise silent apartment. Living alone had its perks. Peace, space, and no one to argue over the remote. That night felt no different from any other. I had just made a cup of tea, and the soft light of the screen was the only thing illuminating my living room. I didn't think much of it when the picture on the screen started to flicker. At first, it was just small, like the static hiccup you'd get from an old cable box. I figured it was a glitch, nothing a quick channel flip wouldn't fix. But then the static grew worse, louder, distorting the image. The picture warped in and out, like someone was manually twisting the dials of an old analog set. That was the first thing that made me pause. My TV wasn't old. It was a new flat screen, only a couple of years old. I aimed the remote at the screen and hit the power button. It went dark. Figures, I muttered, setting the remote aside and deciding I'd deal with it later. Maybe I just needed to reset the box. But when I stood up to head into the kitchen, something strange caught my eye. The TV turned itself back on. At first, I thought maybe I had accidentally sat on the remote or hit a button as I stood. But no, the remote was untouched, sitting on the table. The static had returned, but this time it wasn't random. Fuzzy images started to form, the kind you'd see in old black and white movies. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The scene on the screen, it looked familiar. Too familiar. It was a living room, but not just any living room, my living room. The same worn-out couch, the same bookshelf with the mismatched books, and the same crooked painting I'd been meaning to straighten for months. My heart skipped a beat. I sat back down slowly, eyes glued to the screen. How the hell was this on my TV? I leaned in closer, convinced it was some kind of trick, maybe a reflection or a weird home camera I didn't know I had. But there were no cameras in my apartment, and nothing should be broadcasting my living room. As I watched, the camera angle shifted slightly, giving me a better view of the entire room. Something about it felt wrong. Like the air was thicker, like I wasn't alone in my own space. I turned the TV off again, harder this time, making sure the button clicked. The screen went black, the faint hum of the electronics dying out. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I walked toward the hallway, glancing back just to be sure everything was off. But when I passed by the living room again, the TV had turned itself on again. This time, the static was gone, replaced by a clear, crisp image. It was my apartment again, but now something was different. There was a figure in the room, blurry at first, like a smudge on the lens, but it moved, slowly. I watched, frozen in place, as the figure wandered near the bookshelf, trailing a hand over the spines of the books, just as I often did when I was searching for something to read. Couldn't breathe. I looked around the living room, scanning every corner. There was no one there. It was just me. Yet, on the screen, the figure was moving, exploring my space like it had every right to be there. The figure stepped closer to the camera now, as if realizing it was being watched. I felt a lump form in my throat. The closer it got, the clearer it became, though its edges remained blurred, like the image couldn't quite fully solidify. Stopped, standing in the middle of the room, staring directly into the camera, or rather directly at me. Panic took over. I scrambled for the remote, slamming every button, desperate to turn the thing off, but nothing happened. The figure in the screen began to move again, this time toward the couch I was sitting on. It wasn't possible. I was alone. I could see that I was alone. But the figure on the TV, that indistinct shape, was approaching the exact spot where I sat. My hands shook as I pressed the power button on the remote again and again. It stayed on, the picture taunting me, showing me something that couldn't be happening. Then, the figure stepped in front of the camera, its face still hidden in shadow, and for the first time, I noticed the heavy, distorted breathing coming from the TV speakers. Each exhale filled the room, thick and slow. My skin prickled. Suddenly, the camera view on the TV zoomed in on the figure's face. The fuzziness dissipated, and the face became horribly clear. It was me. My own face stared back at me from the screen, but there was something off, something grotesque. My skin was pale, almost gray, and my eyes, they were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow everything around them. The version of me on the screen opened its mouth slowly, as if trying to speak, but no words came out, only that heavy, rasping breath. I dropped the remote, my entire body shaking, when I heard it, not through the TV this time, but behind me, that same breathing, slow, ragged, so close I could feel it on the back of my neck. I didn't want to turn around. Every part of my body screamed at me to run, to get out of the apartment. But I was frozen. I could feel the presence behind me, the air thickening with every breath it took. The lights in the room flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The last thing I saw, before the darkness swallowed everything, was the reflection of myself on the TV screen. smiling, wide and unnatural. And then, silence. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor of my living room, my face pressed against the cold hardwood. The TV was off, the remote still on the floor beside me. Everything looked normal, too normal, but I knew something was wrong. I could still feel that presence, lingering just out of sight, watching, waiting. And every time I turn the TV on now, I catch glimpses, brief flashes of static, and sometimes, just for a second, my own face, grinning back at me from the other side. I haven't turned the TV on since. Fourth story missed calls. Started out like any other Friday night. I had the house to myself, which I was looking forward to after a long week at work. I'd made dinner, poured myself a glass of wine, and curled up on the couch, ready to lose myself in a movie. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the stillness. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but I figured it was a telemarketer or a wrong number. I ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again. Same number. I sighed, deciding to answer it just to stop the interruptions. "Hello," I said, pressing the phone to my ear. Silence. "Hello," I repeated a little louder this time. No answer, just a faint crackling, like someone was there but not speaking. I hung up, annoyed, and went back to my movie. But the phone rang again. The same number. I answered, feeling my frustration build. Who is this? Still nothing. Just that same static, distant and unnerving. This time, I didn't wait long before hanging up. I turned my phone on silent, tossed it on the couch, and tried to forget about it. For a while, it worked. I was halfway through the movie when I heard it again. The low hum of a phone vibrating. I glanced at the screen and froze. The call was coming from my home number. I hadn't used my landline in years. Who even has a landline anymore? I only kept it because it was bundled with my internet, but I couldn't remember the last time it had rung. And certainly no one should be calling from that number. I stared at the screen, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. The number blinked at me, and without thinking, I swiped to answer. "Hello." My voice cracked slightly, betraying the unease I was trying to suppress. There was silence again, but not the empty kind. This was a thick, oppressive silence, like someone was on the other end, listening. I hung up. The logical side of my brain told me it was a glitch. Phones malfunction sometimes. Maybe a neighbor's line had crossed with mine. I tried to reassure myself, but it wasn't working. Something felt off. Before I could even catch my breath, the landline started ringing. I stared at the phone on the table, its shrill tone cutting through the house. The phone never rang. My pulse quickened as I slowly reached for it, my hand shaking slightly as I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I whispered, not sure why I was speaking so quietly. A pause, and then a voice, familiar but distant. "I'm here." I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear. The voice, was it mine? It sounded just like me, but wrong, like it was coming from far away, warped and distorted. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I'm here. Inside," the voice repeated. I slammed the phone down and backed away, my heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my throat. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but I didn't know what to say. I was alone. No one could be inside. I ran through the house, checking every door, every window. They were all locked, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. And then, the landline rang again. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. Something inside me was screaming not to answer it, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked up the receiver, my fingers trembling. "Stop calling me," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty house. This time, there was no pause. The voice responded immediately, clear and chilling. "I'm inside the house." My blood ran cold. The words echoed in my head, and a terrifying realization settled over me. The calls, they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside. I threw the phone down and ran to the door, my hand fumbling with the lock. I needed to get out, but something stopped me. A low, rhythmic sound. Breathing. It wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from somewhere else. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I listened. The breathing was faint but close, too close. I followed the sound, my feet moving mechanically, leading me up the stairs toward the attic door. I hadn't been in the attic in months. Why would I? It was just a dusty, forgotten space filled with old boxes and unused junk. But as I reached the door, the breathing grew louder, more deliberate, like whoever or whatever. It was knew I was coming. With shaking hands, I pulled the attic ladder down and climbed up, one step at a time. The air grew colder the higher I went, the darkness swallowing me as I stepped into the attic. I fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have blown. That's when I saw it. The phone, the landline, sitting in the middle of the attic floor. It was off the hook, the receiver dangling lifelessly by its cord. I didn't remember ever bringing the phone up here. In fact, I didn't even know how it had gotten up there. I stared at it, heart hammering in my chest, when suddenly, the line crackled to life. And that breathing, it wasn't coming from the phone. I felt a presence behind me, the air thick with something that didn't belong. Couldn't breathe. Slowly, too scared to move, I turned around, my eyes wide, the darkness pressing in from all sides. There, just beyond the edge of the dim light from the hallway, something moved, a figure. Before I could react, the world went black. I woke up hours later, lying on the attic floor, my body cold and stiff. The phone was still off the hook, and the house was silent again, but I knew something had changed. I was no longer alone in my own home, and no matter what I do now, the phone never stops ringing.